let's turn to chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. And, it's a judgment call whether to read the chapter together or not. I don't think we'll take the time to do that, but I would hopefully you've read, maybe. And I'd like us to identify the elements of the story. When if you were going to tell this story and you wanted to hit the points that needed to be hit to make sure people got the gist of it, what would you include?
Well, it was King Belshazzar, and it was important that they were using, for their party celebration, they were using things that they had taken from the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, good. So okay.
Praising the gods out of the,
So using the utensils out of the temple, drinking wine in a big party and praising the gods of gold and silver and
bronze and iron and wood and.
stones and iron and wood, yeah. Yeah, maybe offering a libation, yeah. Yeah,
And
All
our
right.
God didn't take kindly to that.
yeah, our God did not take kindly to that. Okay, so what happened then?
They saw writing on the wall.
Yeah, and who saw it?
The queen?
Yeah, Belshazzar
The
saw
king
it.
saw, yeah.
It's not clear whether everybody else saw it. But presumably they did. Where is the writing on the wall taking place?
Opposite, the king's palace opposite the lampstand.
Yours says opposite?
Uh-huh.
Mhm, mine does too.
Mine was too.
Mine says near.
Yeah.
Mine says in the light of the lamp.
Oh.
Mine says next to the lampstand.
Mine says next to.
Yeah.
I always thought, that the writing just appeared, like on the wall, but that he saw a human hand. it
I
says.
saw a hand,
Mhm.
Yeah.
not connected to a body.
Yeah,
That would be a little freaky, wouldn't it?
yeah.
That's what here on your neck.
Yeah, it sure would.
He got a little, he was
A
overcome.
little-
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Knees are not you.
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Okay, so,
Remember, they were drinking from the golden cups.
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, so we probably should say that the context here is a massively big party. I got to thinking about, 1,000 lords and all the other people. So the lords and their ladies and the king's wives and concubines, and this would have been a big party. I got to thinking, wow, that's a lot of people. And then I thought about some of the events I attended when I was chaplain at SMU and some of the bigger hotels. There could be 1,000 people sitting
Mhm,
like in banquet
mhm.
around tables, around round tables in a banquet style. And so I sort of got a picture of the size of the party, and it's the king is kind of showing off because he's drunk, probably. And then he sees this hand and he sees the writing, and then what happens?
Calls for his wise men.
Right,
Come and tell me what this means.
Mine says the enchanters.
yeah, yeah. Okay. And
And they can't.
they successfully interpret the writing, right?
No.
Wrong.
So here we find that there's a repeated theme. We've run into this before. These guys are no good at their job. Okay, so they can't do it. So then what happens?
The queen
Yeah,
remembers Daniel.
right.
Or what's the name? Belshazzar.
Belteshazzar,
Right.
Belteshazzar, yeah. Yeah. And probably the queen is the queen mom. It's probably Belshazzar's mother. Because it mentions his wives and concubines, and then it says the queen.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So that, the Bible, the interpreters think it's probably the queen mom. Which adds a little, her sons, her son is sort of dissolving into a puddle of fear. And she's the wise, self-controlled figure in this picture. Okay, so
Is-
mom,
It says here, your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed this man, so it must be his mother.
yeah,
Mhm.
right,
Mhm.
right. Okay, and how is Daniel described then?
Wisdom of the gods were found in him.
Yeah, wisdom, he's got wisdom,
Intelligent,
spirit of the holy gods,
like the gods, yeah.
yeah. Okay. When he's brought before the king and he interprets this writing, how does he talk to the king?
Like a prophet.
Yeah, it's a very prophetic kind of approach he takes. He's pretty blunt with the king, isn't he?
Keep your
Yeah.
money to yourself kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
I don't want your dirty stinking money. Yeah. Okay, and then he interprets the words. What we're gonna look at in some detail at these things, but he interprets what the words mean, and then what happens to the king. Yeah. He's dispatched quickly in one verse, right at the end of the chapter. Okay. So we see a lot of repetition. And, pretty vivid descriptions of things. So, all right.
Okay, Steve, this was a changing of the guard. Between 4 and 5, Nebuchadnezzar dies and this Belshazzar becomes king.
Uh-huh.
Right.
And this is
Mhm.
20 years later.
Sorry?
And this is a couple decades later. He's been king for a while. Or not.
Golly, I don't remember that. I don't think it tells us how long Belshazzar has been king. Am I forgetting?
No, I mean, at the end of chapter 4, it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and at the beginning of chapter 5, it's talking about Belshazzar. So
Yeah.
It
I
doesn't say.
don't think we know how long Belshazzar has been the king. But you do
Well,
get, I think,
My study notes just say that a couple decades, that Nebuchadnezzar's been dead for a couple of decades.
yeah, I think that's I think it's a logical kind of conclusion.
Mine says he's Nebuchadnezzar's son because there was no term for grandfather in Hebrew or Chaldean.
Right. Well, we'll come back to this because the dates about some things don't line up, but Belshazzar is most likely Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. But it's often because there's the king in between Nebuchadnezzar, who's Nebuchadnezzar the second, Nebuchadnezzar II, and Belshazzar is Nabonidus. And he's the king who goes into like self-imposed exile for about 10 years. So Belshazzar is reigning as king, even though his father is, in terms of title, the king. And some scholars think that story about Nebuchadnezzar's kind of losing his mind and living like an animal for a while, that may have been an event associated with Nabonidus, and that's why the exile, quote unquote. But that's all speculation because there's no way to conclude.
Well, and had Babylon been conquered by this time? Not yet.
Not yet. At the end of chapter 5, that's when we see
It's the need.
Babylonia is now
Take over.
off out of the picture.
Isn't it interesting that last verse, it tells us how old Darius was?
Yeah, 62 when he started to reign.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a weird little detail.
right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go through some of what you shared now, but maybe, slow down a little bit and notice some things. So what is it that gets Belshazzar in trouble?
Well,
Drinking out of the good dishes.
Yeah, yeah. So he brings out the utensils from the temple in Jerusalem. And, sort of struts his stuff by doing that.
So does it say where, what they were celebrating?
No. Just a big, he decided to have as many of his lords as he could get to come in. The number 1,000 is a big number, so it's a big party. And it's I think we're meant to get the idea that it really is a big kind of drunken party. Now, kings who have conquered other nations are not in the habit of offending those other nations' gods. So we might think of the book of Judges and what happens to the Philistines when they steal the Ark of the Covenant from the Jews. So pagan nations are not in the habit of doing what Belshazzar did. So Nebuchadnezzar took these items from the temple and put them in his treasury. Because, they're gold and silver. So it's wealth. Presumably, they could be melted down and used for other things, but Nebuchadnezzar didn't do that. He stored them in the royal treasury. Anyway, rulers were not in the habit of using religious items, other nations' religious items, because you don't want to just offend the god for no reason. And so the picture here is that, praising the gods of gold, silver, wood, stone, etc., looks like some kind of act of pagan worship with Yahweh's utensils from the temple. So I think we're supposed to this is a particularly foolish thing for Belshazzar to do. And so even the pagan peoples hearing this story would think, whoa, that was dumb to do. Offensive, stupid, foolish, however we might want to say that. So it's really, there's more than meets the eye in this story to modern Western people who don't have all that kind of cultural background. So this is really bad, what Belshazzar has done. He looks like a fool. So I pulled out this quote from one of the people I'm reading to do this study. The act was spectacularly sacrilegious even by pagan standards. I know I shouldn't use the word idiot, but I think it's fair to say that the story kind of makes Belshazzar look like an idiot. Yeah, but I wouldn't know that just by reading it, but reading some of the background, it starts to add impact to the story.
Well, it seems like that it was a spur of the moment impulse to do it. I mean, he was already drinking wine.
Yeah.
When he decided to have them brought out. So I don't think it was the table setting when they walked in.
That's true. That's exactly right. He had them brought out. He's, as my dad used to say, he's feeling his oats, maybe. Again, we don't really know, but the story characterizes Belshazzar in not a good light at all. Okay, so let's look closely at Belshazzar's experience now in this, starting with verse 5. How does it describe Belshazzar?
Pale and frightened. The legs became weak, knees were knocking.
Yeah, he's terrified.
Yep.
I think my version uses the word terrified or terrify 3 times in this. So he's terrified. And that's why I wonder if he's the only one who sees this, at least at the beginning. And the hand that appears and writes on the wall. One of the scholars I read kind of pictures this as like it's right over his head. Like he sees this hand come in and writing on the wall right behind his head. You know, with the big lampstand up there, so there's light shining so that he can read the words, but he doesn't know what the words mean. But I sort of picture, I think the story wants us to picture this hand coming into the room, you know? And it's very close to him. So he is terrified. And it's public. I mean, the other people in the room realize he's terrified.
Yeah.
Mine
Says
says that he was so terrified he soiled himself.
Oh,
That's a new one.
okay. Yeah, he's so terrified he soiled himself. Now,
Where does it say that?
In my translation, that's what it says. Yours probably says something like the joints of his hips gave way or something like
Where,
that.
what verse is it?
6.
6. Mhm.
Yeah, my
Mine says-
version, go ahead.
Mine says his face turned pale and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking.
Yeah, that's kind of what mine says.
Well, that he soiled himself. So Deborah, the reason, so the Hebrew, and I'm getting this from the experts, the Hebrew apparently could be rendered something like his loins were loosened. That's pretty close to soiling oneself, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, my
Which
God.
that would be really embarrassing, right? In front of all these people.
That's why it says, and his lords were perplexed.
Right. Okay, so that's his experience. So then he calls in his team of wise men. And so in verse 8 and in verse 15, we see once again the inability of the wise men to understand what's going on here. Now let's take a moment and look back at chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. What's it say there? Somebody read that? 2, 10, and 11.
Says what the king is asking is impossible. No one could declare the dream to the king, but the gods who don't live among mere humans.
Right. So, and there, I mean, it's all the way through chapter 2, but that's a good kind of snapshot of, they're saying we can't do this. Nobody can do that. Okay, chapter 4, verse 7.
Can't find 4.
Same thing.
Mhm.
Their inability, these are incompetent interpreters.
Mhm.
And I think the word incompetent here, the repetition of their inability is a way of saying they don't know what they're doing. They can't do this, right? And the fact that Daniel is made in charge of this group heightens that irony a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, by contrast, let's read 5:11 through 16, the first part of, because the story kind of goes on. The queen kind of goes on about Daniel's wisdom. So 11, there is a man in your kingdom who is endowed with a spirit of the holy gods, or a divine spirit. In the days of your father, he was found to have enlightenment, understanding, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. So enlightenment, understanding, and wisdom. This is a literary device. The repetition of essentially the same thing is a way of enhancing, a way of amplifying the point that the storyteller wants to make. Wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and diviners, or sorcerers. because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding, again, repetition, to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Now notice, the queen is using Daniel's Hebrew name.
Mhm.
Your dad called him Belteshazzar. I'm calling him Daniel.
And why? I mean,
Yeah,
she obviously, there's something else has happened.
she's made the connection, right? She gets the connection between Daniel's God and Daniel's gifts.
This is really similar to Joseph
Yeah,
in Genesis.
Mhm.
very similar. Yeah,
But wouldn't she have probably been around when Nebuchadnezzar had his
Mhm.
change of heart, his
Right.
and so maybe he was with him on that.
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's quite, quite likely.
So she would call him Daniel.
Yeah,
Mhm.
even though her husband called him Belteshazzar.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. And so then, verse 13 and following, we get kind of a repetition. Now we're gonna go ahead and put it in narrative form. We're gonna tell the story, but then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king said to Daniel, "So you are Daniel." Okay, there's the use of the name again. "One of the exiles of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that enlightenment, understanding, and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have brought in before me to read this writing, have been brought in before me to read this writing and tell me its interpretation, but they were not able to give the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems." So it's the style of this kind of story to draw particular attention to things by this kind of repetition. The story is moving on, but as it moves on, it pulls up the characteristics that the storyteller wants us to think about and get. I mean, Daniel is really an outstanding man. Now, he's older, right? As one of the scholars I'm following put it, it's like, he was in this bureau, this office of dream interpreters, and the new king didn't really know Daniel, and he's been kind of sidelined until this moment. Now that's all, just kind of filling in some of the speculation behind, but we can imagine Daniel older. He's brought into this scenario, but again, the contrast between Daniel and these wise men, these Chaldean, Babylonian, pagan wise men, they can't do it. And the reason they can't do it is their gods are nothing. Daniel can do it because his God talks to him and tells him these things. The contrast is really stark. Now, we're asked to imagine what it would be like to be an exiled people. Remember, we talked earlier about, our people don't have the temple anymore. We don't live near Jerusalem, right? Everything that identifies us has been taken away from us. So these stories of faithfulness, and I've got a question about this eventually, but these stories of faithfulness, would they inspire people to be faithful, stand strong, right? Why does Daniel refer to Nebuchadnezzar?
Talking about in verse 18,
Yes.
he looks like he's saying almost that he's a vessel of God. He gave your father sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor, because the high position, he puts people to death who he wants to put to death. He humbles those or he makes them humble, all that stuff.
Yeah, and even though he was great like that, when he didn't humble himself, he
Right.
got himself into trouble.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of get the impression that Daniel is saying to Belshazzar, you remember what happened to your, we might say dad or grand, you remember what happened to your dad? Yeah, who did that?
And why?
And why? Yeah. So, so again, Larry, I think you used the word prophet or prophetic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
here's Daniel confronting this king
Right.
with, you know, with the authority of God, Yahweh. Yeah, so here in chapter 5, we have allusions to these earlier stories in chapter 2 and chapter 4.
Well, and he reminds this guy, this king, that Nebuchadnezzar actually confessed Yahweh, confessed God.
Right.
Went through all of that, and he finally got it, and he confessed God as sovereign.
Yeah. Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar was humbled and to that degree became humble. As a king, was willing to acknowledge that there's a king, a divine king, much more powerful than the king of Babylon.
What were the Babylonian gods? Do you have any idea who they would have worshipped?
Well, Bel
was-
or Marduk, he's also, the Canaanite name is Marduk, so a storm deity. I can't remember the name of the moon god. Yeah, so their sort of national god is Marduk.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Going on. This is still about Nebuchadnezzar. His glory, you know, the New Revised Standard that I'm using, his glory was stripped of him, and then some of the consequences, and then until he learned, right? Here's the warning to Belshazzar. And what did he learn? That the Most High God, El Elyon is the Hebrew here, the Most High God has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals.
Well, and then he says very clearly, but you knew this,
Right,
and you ignored it,
exactly. Exactly,
or even more, you have not humbled yourself.
Yeah.
right, right.
In a way, I mean, the phrase "and sets over it whom he will," that's not what you said something like God decides who will rule. And then that very night, Belshazzar, the king, is killed. So
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah. Right. Yeah, now, the question that's lurking here, we touched on this when we did some of the introductory material at the beginning. The question that's lurking is that most scholars say that these stories are to some degree based on things that happened, but they've been fictionalized a little bit. So we're reading these stories, we're hearing these stories. I mean, again, if we can imagine being among the people who are exiled. And then as we go further into the book of Daniel, the 2nd century Antiochus Epiphanes really emerges. And he is a brutal, oppressive king who does desecrate the temple. By that time, the temple has been rebuilt. We have what we know as now Second Temple Judaism, and he has desecrated the temple. So most of the scholars tell us that the people hearing these stories are living under the conditions in 2nd century BC Israel, where this oppressive king is doing these things. And so using the name of Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar and telling these stories about heroes from the past that maybe we can't verify everything. And as you know, as we've tried to look at here, these stories, the way they're told with all this long conversation, you know, it's not like Chronicles where you get events and you get actions the king takes. You might get a decree, an official decree, but that's written down in a record someplace. This isn't like that. And some of these stories, and we're gonna get to the chronology when we get to chapter 6. Some things just don't, they don't show up anywhere in any kind of historical document, and the dates don't line up exactly right. And so the question of how would they be inspiring if to some degree they didn't actually happen that way, right? So we're gonna have to grapple with that, I think, in just a moment, but later. Okay, the words. Here we get the words written by the bodiless hand on the wall. There is a wordplay, which is often the case with, you know, Hebrew names and things like that. The wordplay. So Mene is close to Mina, which was a monetary unit.
Money.
Yeah, yeah, or numbers, right? Amounts. And the king is kind of showing off his wealth. Okay. And what is the interpretation from Joseph? We have to look toward the end of the story to find it, like verse,
God
I'm
has
sorry,
numbered,
Joseph. I'm sorry,
God has numbered your days.
Daniel.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say.
That's why you were giving me those blankets. Okay,
So numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end.
right. Your days are numbered. The days of your kingdom. So mene, number. And with that play on words there. Okay. Days are numbered. Tekel.
You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting.
Right. So
Mhm.
weight, right? It's yeah. And then parson. Parson is close to the word Paris, which means division. And so your kingdom is going to be divided.
So all that's money related.
I don't know that all of it is, but I think it's the satire of,
Yeah.
you know, a king, a wealthy king, a powerful king, banking on, you know, I guess pun intended here, banking on these worldly measures of power. And Yahweh is not the least bit limited by any of these usual means.
Daniel very pointedly calls out the disrespect to Yahweh's.
Right.
And I mean, it's not as if he is, you know, the interactions with Nebuchadnezzar, and it could be because he was a lot younger, but it seemed that he was much more accommodating is the wrong word, but more respectful. He was
Right.
he didn't come
Deferential.
harshly,
Right.
whereas
Yeah,
this is
deferential.
pretty much,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, Daniel talks to Belshazzar like he's a wayward little boy.
Yeah.
Yes.
worse. Mhm.
Yeah, or worse. And yeah, so the offense to Yahweh, Daniel feels acutely,
Mhm.
and he doesn't hold back.
Mhm.
And this is the end of the Babylonian Empire. Right? That's it. In one verse, they depart the stage. And that's part of the story, right? God has acted decisively, and in a very short time, Belshazzar is dead.
which would be inspirational for those in the second
Mhm.
century
Yep,
hearing that.
That's right.
a little bit of hope.
That's right. We like it when the bad guy gets what's coming to him.
You know, you say it like that, and you said this before, both last week and this week, and maybe all of Daniel so far, it reads a little bit like a Iron Man movie. In that, you know, the hero has exaggerated strength and, you know, exaggerated wisdom, and the bad guy really does get,
Yeah,
you know, I mean, it's that kind, they're like, okay, they're like, what is the brand that did Iron Man? That,
Marvel?
yes,
Marvel.
they're like caricatures or
Yeah, yeah,
not a comic, not a, you know, but you know what I mean?
yeah.
Just larger than life
Larger than
heroes
life,
and
yeah.
stronger than, and the bad guy always gets it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think these stories have that quality with the additional, they have those strengths because
Yeah.
Yahweh has given them.
Right.
So the glory really goes to God.
Mhm.
Yeah. But it's sort of like superpowers, you know, Daniel's is the ability to interpret dreams.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Now, I think it's interesting that Daniel had refused the gold chain, purple, the third highest ruling,
yeah,
but yet we have testimony that, no, he got it.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, God still exalted him
Mhm.
because Daniel was faithful, right? Daniel, and, you know, let's face it, it's risky. There's no guarantee that he had that the outcome
Mhm.
would go a certain way, so it's risky, but God
My
can,
dad was real affirming to, Belshazzar. I mean, God's numbered your days, your
Yeah.
reign is at an end, you're gonna lose your kingdom.
right?
That's not good news.
No, it's not. No,
In front of all those people.
right. Yeah, it's really, Belshazzar looks like a buffoon and he's humiliated
Mhm.
all the way through this story. And again, if you're among powerless people living under oppressive systems, that would feel pretty good, right? The bad guy gets it. Don't want to go too far there. Okay. So Daniel 6 now, before we look at the
Before we
detail.
get to that,
Yeah,
can I
okay.
ask a question?
Sure.
The seeing the writing on the wall that's a euphemism that we still use.
Right.
Is that a lesson? Is that something we should look for? And not real writing, but you know, there's a lot going on, there has been, but
Mhm.
in Germany in 1936.
Shouldn't they have seen the writing on the wall?
Yeah. Yeah, that's, you know, toward the sort of the wrap up, which we may not get to, but I had a couple of kind of wrap up questions that are
Okay.
like that. No, it's good. Yeah, we should see. And this is one of those examples of cultural literacy, right? When people you see the writing on the wall or they whatever, and don't realize it came from the Bible, right?
Mhm.
So it's one of those situations. Okay, now before we get into Daniel 6, let's look at the chronological kind of wrinkles here. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar that we've been talking about, these are his reigning dates, right? He lived longer than this, but he did have a long reign. And you see his dates there. And then I put in parentheses, who follows him is Nabonidus, his son. But Nabonidus it looks like Belshazzar is involved kind of from the beginning of Nabonidus's reign, particularly with this 10-year exile that Nabonidus does. And that is in the official records of Babylon. This isn't part of the story, that's actual history. So when the Bible calls Belshazzar the son of Nebuchadnezzar, we know that the use of the word son here can refer to more than a biological generational thing. He might be a grandson, literally, and still be the son of, so the student of a teacher, a really close student of a teacher could be called the son of the teacher. So we could use the word son here metaphorically as well as literally, and you get a kind of a combination of both maybe in a way. But Belshazzar is the next generation, not the one immediately following Nebuchadnezzar. And you see the dates there. And then in chapter 6, we get Darius or Darius, the Persian king. And look at his dates. And then Cyrus, in the way the stories are told,
And
or in the
Daniel,
way accounts are given.
and Daniel was around for all of them?
That's part of the issue,
Uh-huh.
right? That's part of the
He
issue.
was an old man.
Yeah, that's part of the issue. That, you know, scholars are trying to figure out the chronology, but,
There's some years unaccounted for there too.
Yeah,
yeah, and I mean, that's, you know, you look at these kinds of details and then what counts as evidence for which kind of conclusion? That's what the scholars are always trying to figure out. And, but we do have,
Cause Cyrus and Belshazzar overlap. Right?
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So if you look at Daniel 6, verse 28, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Well, that's okay, because Darius and Cyrus are are the rulers of two different kingdoms.
No, they're not.
Darius is the Mede, Cyrus is a Persian.
Yeah, but those become the same kingdom.
Well, they might become the same kingdom, but apparently they're not at that moment.
Well, but they are. Cyrus is the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And he comes before Darius.
Okay,
So I don't need to make a huge issue of
Okay.
this, but this is one of those, when you start digging into the historical chronological details, something doesn't work in the way we normally think about things. But the point is, Daniel, the way Daniel is constructed isn't worried about making everything line up with perfect historical precision, because there's more going on here than just history, right? Okay, so let's get into Daniel 6 now, and let's do a similar thing here. Kind of talk through the big. If you were telling this story, what would people need to know?
The king made a decree that they shall all bow to him,
Okay,
and if
and how
not,
did,
you're in trouble.
yeah, and how did he get to the point of making that decree?
Some of his underlings convinced him that this is the right path to take.
Yeah, it sort of feels like he gets pressured into it, right? He kind of gets backed into a corner.
They were jealous.
Yeah, they're jealous of Daniel again.
It kind of sounds like what happened to Jesus.
Yeah, got railroaded, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so we haven't, he's innocent. Daniel is really the innocent victim here.
Well, I mean, it's kind of parallel to Esther. You've got Mordecai and you've got the evil Haman or Haman.
Right,
And it's the same story. you
right,
know.
yeah. And so Darius is sort of forced to make the decree, and then he's forced to keep the decree when they rat out Daniel to him. So he's kind of backed into the corner. Daniel goes into the lion's den. We know how that turns out. And let's look at the very end of chapter 6 then. How does it turn out for Daniel?
He prospered.
Right,
And the reign of Cyrus.
And he gives
yeah.
praise to Yahweh.
Yeah, yeah, those previous two verses, 26 and 27.
God of Daniel. Yeah.
His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. We're gonna see that again in chapter 7. When the son of one like a son of man is presented to the Ancient of Days, he's gonna receive that kingdom. Okay,
So is he acting like Nebuchadnezzar now, recognizing the Jewish God?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he is. Okay, let's talk about how the story pictures Darius. How does he look in the story?
Passionate towards Daniel,
Sensible.
Sorry, Linda?
compassionate towards Daniel.
Yeah, he really likes Daniel.
He really didn't want to put him in with that lion.
Right. Yeah,
He also
and he
comes-
does. Go ahead, Deborah.
because he comes across a kind of weak. He lets
Hmm.
people manipulate him.
Yeah, he got backed into a corner. He had to stick with his word because they
Mhm.
kind of wrangled this decree out of him, and you know, he can't look weak in front of the people, so he's got to go through with it. But he's not in control of this scene. He's not the big powerful king on the throne here. He's, as a character, he's been manipulated into a bad situation.
Sort of like Herod and John the Baptist.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
It's like he's a people pleaser.
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah.
He tries to do what's right and he's trying to keep everybody happy and
Mhm.
Right. But again, in terms of these themes that kind of keep recurring in these stories, the king, the person that conventionally is thought of as being powerful and strong and courageous and with it, just aren't. They just aren't, right? In every case, they are brought low. These powerful kings are brought low by Yahweh, the Lord.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have the professional jealousy of these satraps and presidents, and
Mhm.
because they don't like, Daniel's kind of in charge over all of them,
Mhm.
and they don't like it. They know he's a faithful Jew, and so they're gonna figure out a way to cut him down.
Mhm.
And that too is like Esther.
Mhm. Yeah, very much.
Mhm.
Now,
And the very same thing. Xerxes, the king and Esther, where that is, it's even further east. He gives a decree and he can't take it back either.
right,
It's the same
yeah,
notion. And once it's written, too bad.
Mhm.
now, one of the Bible, the Old Testament experts I'm following says there's no record of this kind of principle about the law of the Medes and the Persians. Once a law is stated, you can't revoke that law. That doesn't appear anywhere in any of the records available. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen,
Or it wasn't practiced even.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
when you look at the other records, kings change their mind all the time. They could issue a law and then issue another law that countermands the previous law. So maybe that the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked, that sort of thing. Maybe that's just a way of intensifying the trap that Darius has gotten himself into here.
Well, because this law deals with honor and shame,
Mhm. That's right.
which is currency. I mean, that's their currency more than anything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah,
And
mean,
so
yeah.
he can't possibly, as a king, shame himself
right,
even more. He can't do it. He wouldn't be king.
right.
Which makes it's a cultural law
Oh,
as
very much.
opposed to a legal thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Well, this was just supposed to be a 30-day law.
right,
Uh,
right. Totally concocted. Okay, again, let's notice the characterization of Daniel in this passage, and those verses there help. Verse 3, Daniel distinguished himself above all the other leaders, you know, and it's just, it's a very consistent kind of portrayal of this guy, Daniel. And then how the story tells Darius's opinion about Daniel. I mean, it's really, it's very, Darius sees Daniel as a trusted, kind of right-hand man sort of person. Okay, then at the end of Daniel 6, after it's all, you know, the lion's den incident has happened, Darius issues another decree. And this time, not worship me, but worship Yahweh, right? This Daniel's God is more powerful than all the other gods.
For he is the living God.
Well, and the other thing he notes, you know, the power and all of that, like living.
Right,
Mhm.
right. Okay, so as we draw to close here, some of these, as I call them, takeaways. We see very clearly in Daniel 1 through 6, God's sovereignty over the nations. There's this theme through all these chapters. And whatever the dilemma is that these faithful Jews face, God comes through. So, you know, the exhortation would be stay faithful. Don't accommodate to these cultural pressures. We live in a foreign land. We live among strangers. We live in a strange culture to us. There's all kinds of uncleanness around us. Let's stay faithful. You can imagine Daniel working like that. And the no matter what part, right? I mean, we remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow the knee. So that puts a little stiffness in the spine, right? So does it do anything? This is a question of how we generally understand Bible writings. Does the story, if they are to some degree fictional, does that make me go, okay, well, so yeah, you can tell that story, but it didn't really happen that way, so it doesn't have the same kind of impact. Good story, but doesn't inspire me. There's a kind of a cynical, is that an issue here or not?
Can't the Holy Spirit inspire fiction?
That's a good question, a fun question.
I mean, if it's inspired scripture, does it matter? If
Yeah.
it's not historically accurate, does it matter if it's embellished?
If there's a lesson to be learned out of it.
Yeah.
I can say that in my younger years, I would have been crushed at the idea that I would have resented you using the word embellished or that would have been painful to me because I understood truth as meaning historical accuracy.
Yeah, factually,
Yeah.
this is the way it happened.
Yeah,
In every case.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would have it would have broken my heart to hear you say that. But I guess I could say I've come a long way, because I see that, as I like the way Deborah put it, you know, that it's true, it is a truth. What we have just read is a truth in the sense that this is how God leads his people. This is how God teaches his people, you know, and whether or not it's what I used to think of as true, meaning historical accuracy, I see that's a 21st century box that I was living in.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just
Somebody-
saying, same
Uh-huh.
here, that's how I was raised too. And I still have friends that, oh my gosh, if I said that, if if you don't believe it's historically accurate, then you can't accept any of it.
Right.
And if we believe that all of the Bible is God breathed, and there's a reason for it being there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is I sort of feel like this is a really major kind of challenge for modern day Christians. So I think two things stand out to me. If we recognize that God spoke to people and led people to gather a group of writings that we now call the Bible, and that that process of working through these accounts and stories and all that was superintended by God. That's sort of the anchor point. Then I can learn to read carefully. And where it's very clear that the Bible passage intends for us to think factual, this really happened. I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians 15 with Paul's arguing like a lawyer would argue about the resurrection of Jesus. And it's not just resuscitation. This is something different, that it really happened. And all the gospel accounts do that too, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so where the Bible shows us, it really means for us to take this as actual, factual, literal, historical, right? Or this is the way God really is. Then I learned to read it that way. Where I see, like in Daniel, where God is still speaking, but speaking in a more kind of parabolic way through stories that I don't have to say, well, they have to be historically accurate or they're no good. Learning to read with that kind of detail and some flexibility, I think really helps people.
Well, these were God's people.
Mhm.
Yahweh's people, strangers in a very strange land. And we don't really even know who's writing this,
Right.
who's recording it.
Right.
Jesus calls out Daniel, so I would say Daniel was a real guy.
Yeah.
I don't know about the edicts and the annals of Babylon and all of that. I mean, that would be interesting to study.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think I agree with you. So I think Daniel was a historical figure, a real guy, probably one of those young, talented Jewish men put to work
Mhm.
in the Babylonian regime. Whether everything recorded in Daniel actually happened in Daniel's life is a different sort of thing. He might become the sort of the character in these stories that people can relate to and be inspired by. So I wanted to ask that question about how we read and, how we take these stories. Because that does sort of set us up when we get into the other chapters in Daniel and we start trying to understand these visions. Again, an overly face value acceptance kind of reading probably doesn't help us understand what the prophecies are really about.
Steve, I had read something recently that was talking about how that view of reading the Bible kind of started like in response to the Enlightenment. It was kind of like the fundamentalists' reaction to the Enlightenment when people started to question things that happened in the Bible. Well, there weren't really miracles, it's all literary, devices and this and that. And then the fundamentalists came back and said, no, it's got to be literal. And it's like that kind of viewpoint shapes the way we tend to think about things still.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Basically speaking, I think that's really at the heart of the difficulty that we have. And there's kind of this irony about, when people read these what they would take, and we looked at some of this, these offensive, like God commanding, wipe out all these people, right?
Right.
They take that very literally, and then they say, well, the God we worship couldn't be that way, so I don't have to pay attention to that scripture because that's not really God.
Yeah.
Mhm.
See, that's the mistake. That's kind of the other side of the coin mistake that I think we also need to avoid. So and partly it's because of everything that's, happening around us with denominational conflict and all the other stuff. These questions seem live in a certain way that maybe they aren't quite so pressing at other times.
Well, they're pretty pressing.
Yeah.
I think they've been pretty pressing.
Yeah, yeah. All right, friends. Well, I hope you have a blessed Holy Week. We'll see you in 2 weeks and we'll start with Daniel 7. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.